Hey everybody, welcome to episode 37 of Radio Free Ortono. I thought it'd be fun to do an intro again today because we got a couple of firsts today. We have our first returning guest, which is pretty easy because he's our only guest that we've had. We have John back today.
Hello.
51 weeks. We missed it by a week from his last time. So we're going to try and get this episode a bump above the second place that his last episode is in our all-time rankings. And we have our first remote today because Patty is feeling a little poorly. So he is coming in remotely. So today, hello. Today we want to talk about the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel. We're going to solve all the world's problems again. No, wait a minute. We don't do solutions here. But and I wanted to kind of touch on student activism that we're seeing in the West. In the United States and in Canada, but around the West, and how it seems to be kind of rhyming a bit with the history of like student activism, specifically in Europe in like the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and how somehow Israelis end up being the focus of it for some reason. Mm-hmm. So, if anybody's got anything to add, chip in.
I mean, where to start? I mean, there's so many places we can go with this. This is going to be another one of those episodes where it's four guys agreeing with everything they say. But
yeah. Well, yeah.
I mean, the parallels with the 60s are obviously there. Because we're talking, especially when we start talking about the Europeans, as we were prior to the introduction, when you're talking about those groups back in the day, the JRA, the RAF, the Brigate Rosse, all of those, they're all disaffected, middle-class white kids.
And Japanese.
Well.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, disaffected middle classes for sure.
And we're definitely seeing that. And they're hijacking an agenda to the extent now that we have indigenous groups here in Canada who are saying, okay, you guys, we don't agree with what you're saying about Hamas and Israel, and we don't agree with what you're saying about us, and stop lumping us in with you. Like you're making these issues your own, and they're not our issues.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a lot of that same shit going on right now.
There was a good moment in irony on the internet today when a bunch of Gaza protesters blocked a pride parade somewhere in the U.S. today.
And they were queers for Palestine that were doing the blocking. So it's the left eating its own, and this is a leftist talking, right? I mean, it's we've seen this many times before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really weird, but it's like I said before we did the intro that when you ended up in a place like at Entebbe, where you had Germans committing a hijacking for Palestinians and killing Jews to prevent the rise of fascism.
Well,
just kind of like we're in the upside down now.
One of the hostages that was there, because that was 76, actually had been in one of the camps and was showing his tattoo to the German terrorists, saying, basically, dude, what the hell?
Like, what are you doing?
I think he ended up dying too. That hostage, he was one of the 3 killed.
Yeah. Patty, you're very quiet. You're reading.
Oh, I'm just soaking all this in, seeing where you guys are going with it.
It's not like
I know what I like. I've been doing a lot of thinking about it, and I, as might be expected, I take a much more kind of, I don't know. I think there's more going on than just spawn. Like, I don't think this is a legitimate political culture that we're seeing. I think this is a manufactured political culture that we're looking at, much the same way that the peace movement of the 1980s was manufactured. And I think the same kind of forces are at play.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. The leftist movements of the 60s, 70s, and 80s had a lot of help clandestinely from the Soviet Union.
So that begs a great question there, Patty. Is how much external, and I say external, I'll say external to Western nations? How much external influence is being brought to bear to create what's happening right now?
Well, going by the work that, say, Warren Kinsella has done with the Toronto Sun. Now, I haven't seen his methodology. I've only know what he claims are his results. But his view is that these protests, these campus protests and street protests, are being funded and organized, or say funded in terms of raw money and also their materials. Digital ads, this sort of thing being created by the Iranians. And TikTok is a very large organizing method. So, and we can't say that the Chinese certainly don't have a motive to spread discord and disunity in the United States. And I would also throw the Russians in there, who benefit by having the United States distracted away from Ukraine to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I would think that they have probably gone into their old Rolodex from Section 9 of the KGB and said, hey, we can fire up these old contacts and these old organizations that all went defunct. You know, like the old, like, again, the peace movement that folded in 91 when the Soviets stopped funding and organizing it. Get back in touch with those old, some of those old membership are now university faculty. Some of those radical students in the 1980s are now members of the establishment. So they simply fire those guys up again and use them as the organizers, the Iranians as the bankrollers, and the Chinese as Chinese tools as the communication method. And now you have an instant manufactured political culture.
But I mean, even without all of those organizing and doing things in concert, I mean, social media has made it possible. I mean, the Arab movements themselves, the Palestinian movements themselves, have had plenty of opportunity to leverage and influence all this just by using, like, TikTok is TikTok, Instagram is Instagram. Right. So they're just using these things. So you don't need the Chinese government to be behind the use of TikTok to make this happen.
No, not for the Arab or Muslim diasporas. Those guys are organizing, I think, on their own. It's the spoiled middle class, upper middle class white kids that you talked about, who really don't know anything about the issues. They don't know anything about Gaza. They don't know anything about the Middle East, but they're passionate about this because they're told to be passionate about it. Without this 3-level cooperation from external to North America, you don't get those people coming out for protest.
No, I agree. And I agree that there's a lot of organization going on. But it's like that's the yeast that was planted. It was this disaffected youth, like all disaffected youth, has just been waiting for a cause. And this is a perfect storm now, again, with social media and the way things are and trolling. And I mean, John and I were talking about this on the way over here, just how it's the loud extreme voices that are getting all the airtime because they're the only ones who give a shit about putting stuff out on the air. Moderate, reasonable people are just not inclined to venting their moderation, right? I mean,
and moderate reason isn't as exciting.
No. So yeah, all these kids were just waiting for something to gather around, and someone has successfully sparked that and just fanned the flames.
They've also been conditioned since they were children to believe that the 60s social unrest, like the quiet revolutions of the 1960s, were some kind of cultural ideal people should aspire to. Again, they've been programmed for this through education, through popular culture, that this is something that every generation should have. Every generation is supposed to have their Woodstock moment. So yeah, they're I wouldn't call them disaffected youth. I would call them expectant youth, saying, well, we need to have something that we should get all riled up about. And someone is there, the thought leaders have said, here it is. Go at it, kids. And then off they go. But again, what I think should be held foremost in our analysis of this is they really don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I'm talking about the university students. They have no idea what the issue is about. They're out there because they're told to be out there. And the second that message stops coming, they're going to forget about it.
But it's a couple points here. Comparison of the protests of the 60s and 70s to today, how the message is getting out is dramatically different, right? So if you are a Russian malign actor in the 70s and you want to cause civil unrest in the U.S., your tools for doing that are pretty limited, right? Like you literally,
no doubt about it.
You physically need to go over.
Mm-hmm.
You need to make contacts. You need to
Yep.
cultivate contacts, and you need to have those contacts act as your proxy.
Yeah,
And-
you
and
need
that has
someone
to-
to hand out those pamphlets on the street corner. You need someone to put the posters up on the bulletin boards. Whereas now, this is all done digitally.
It's all done digitally. Exactly right. So the dynamic for creating the chaos and the dynamic for creating the noise, because it's become noise, right? It's just who's making the most noise.
Yep.
Well, if we make the most, the message becomes secondary. It's who's yelling the loudest.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important distinction between what was happening in the 60s and 70s, all the way in 80. You take whatever time period you want to now. It's much easier to put out a message. It's much easier to blast that message. And frankly, there's 24-hour news cycle, social media, all these things. There's less checks and balances on it, oddly enough, even though in theory there should be more.
Hey, let me ask you guys a question. Do you have to yell the loudest now, or do you just have to know how best to manipulate the algorithms now?
I think it's algorithmic manipulation, right? To get yourself, because yelling, well, it is manipulating the algorithm is yelling the loudest.
Yeah, I was going
right?
to say that there's no separating the two nowadays.
Yeah. So it's not. It's not. It's
it
not.
doesn't matter how much I create if the algorithm doesn't pick up my content and widely disseminate it.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter how much I do.
If it doesn't put it in front of other eyeballs, then you're screwed.
But the algorithms are all about the passion and the anger, right? That's
That's where the Chinese and TikTok come in.
Yeah.
Yes. It's interesting in the U.S. right now, and I don't know if you're seeing them in Canada, but TikTok has a media campaign in the U.S. to talk about how great TikTok is for the U.S. society. and it's a media campaign, commercials, constant commercials, talking that they'll have some guy, oh, this is my business and I rely on TikTok and blah, blah, blah. And it's really interesting to see that happening, how this social media organization is advertising itself blatantly.
Yeah.
And we know what's going on with the U.S. government. And
or has it or has it not been banned yet?
Have there any been?
what it's not been banned, but they have directed that the Chinese government ownership of TikTok has to be passed on.
Yeah, I mean,
Divested. So
Yeah.
so
12 shell companies later.
yeah, well, right. So, but it's interesting to see all these commercials. And like you'll be watching a show, and all of a sudden there's a commercial about how great TikTok is, and why we need to have it. And
Yeah,
and
right.
it's yeah. Can I relate a quick anecdote? Kind of going back
Absolutely.
to the. This is a recent anecdote. Just happened to me within the last 2 weeks. I was traveling around in Europe, and I ran into this young gal from Southern California, and had a conversation. And late 20s, post university, but somehow the conversation of what was going on in Israel came up, and the protests, and from her perspective, a lot of condemnation of the Israeli government.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just asked a few fundamental questions, and it was the tone I got from her was a lot of praise for the students for being out there and having this cause, and so asked the basic interrogatives like, okay, so you're condemning what the Israelis are doing, so Netanyahu's government's doing well, they're committing genocide. Well, they're not committing genocide, but okay, what should they do? And the answer I got was, I don't know, but not what they're doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's kind of what I get.
Right? Like, you don't have an answer. You don't have an answer.
No.
And everything
Yeah.
came back to that. You don't have an answer.
Yeah.
Conversation.
See, I don't know, but not what they're doing. Yeah.
Right. And you're incensed by, well, they only killed 1,200 people, and the Israelis have killed over 30,000. Well, okay. Yes. But why? Why is that happening? Do you have a clue how Hamas works? Do you have a clue about their style of warfare is actually about creating casualties on their own side?
Yeah. Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
you're trying to fight a counterinsurgency against an enemy that has embedded itself as far as it can into its own population, right? And has done as much as it can to use that population as physical shields.
Yes.
No,
against
And
its own destruction.
weaponizes its own civilian casualties.
Yeah, and then
Yes.
exactly. Yeah.
They become critical to its war strategy. In fact, they want those casualties to happen, because then they can request, demand international condemnation of their adversary. But they've set the conditions for that.
That cynicism within their governance is predated, and it's not just about the warfare. I mean, all the funding that comes to them, they're all living in Dubai. Oh, geez, I turned my phone off, but I didn't turn my alarms off. Pardon me.
Oh my God.
They're living in the Emirates, all the leadership. They're living these lavish lifestyles. They have not spent penny one on making the lives of their people any better, right? I mean, that cynicism is across the board, and but again, that's lost in the conversation now.
Yeah, I gotta wonder about that too, right? Because like Hamas seems to have, if the polling is to be believed, like broad support among the people of Gaza generally, but the leadership is living high in the hog. They're billionaires living in Qatar or the UAE. Is this like the fat uncle thing that the Africans do, right? Where they try and like they fatten up the one guy to show how prosperous the tribe is? Is like, I don't understand it. Like the corruption is so in your face. Like, these guys are billionaires. They don't live here. They live somewhere else, and you like it?
But the Palestinian diaspora has been going through that since 48, right? That they've been kept in the public eye. They've been deliberately kept down. You keep them in misery, and that justifies the messaging over and over and over and over again. There are so many parties out there. And even they themselves, if they're kept in that squalor and misery, then their resentment is kept up, right? Again, what do you keep going back to? You go back to the Good Friday Accords. Oh, look, all of a sudden Ireland has an economy, and that's filtering across the border, and there's no disaffected young males anymore. Oh, look, no terrorism anymore, right? Same stuff. You pull people out, you give them education, you give them jobs, you give them an economy, you give them some wealth, some hope, yeah.
So, Trent, how are you going to fund all those tunnels to attack Israel?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the obvious prioritization. But, you talked about messaging earlier, John. I mean, that's, if you're comparing, I'm going to leave the stuff in Europe from the late 60s and early 70s out of it for the moment. Vietnam's the obvious one, I think. And, there was an actual issue at the time. The same way there's a lot going on with Israel right now, right? One doesn't have to be able to look at October 7th and go, okay, that was an evil fucking thing. And that shouldn't have happened. But you don't have to give carte blanche to Israelis before or since, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, right? So you need to be able to have those conversations. The messaging is important. So that's part of the messaging as well, as John had that conversation.
Yeah.
Well, and I think another interesting distinction, and I think this gets lost because I honestly don't hear it talked about very often, but let's solicit your thoughts on it, is it's one thing to fight a terrorist organization, international terrorist organization, which Hamas was. Hamas became a government. Mm-hmm. It became a government of a people, right? Elected at some point in time, stayed in power, whatever. Yeah. But on October 7th, what was the general mood in Gaza amongst the populace? And I draw this question because for all intents and purposes, we always have thought of Hamas and a lot of the Palestinian organizations as terrorist organizations. But when you transition into a government, to me, that means something, right? So what happened was, it wasn't a terrorist organization attacking another country. It was
Another country.
It was a country attacking a country, right? Now, let's look at our history of what we've done when that happens.
Yeah.
You know, it justifies a lot of punching back really, really hard.
As the saying goes, don't mess with America's boats.
Yeah. Yep. So, and it, you know, this is a conversation that doesn't seem to happen about, hey, a country attacked another country.
Yeah.
That country's defended itself. Oh, and by the way, that country actually took hostages on top of everything else. On top of killing 1,200 people. So how does that change the rules? I would say that the Israeli response would be overdone if Hamas was an international terrorist organization that was not recognized by the people of Gaza, and they were just innocent victims of this whole thing. I think that could be a reasonable argument. But it became a government. It became a country, for all intents and purposes, that attacked another country and essentially declared war on them.
Right.
So that, I think, is a very important facet of this current situation that doesn't seem to get a lot of attention.
But there is no logic to what's going on. Right? We were talking about the Queers for Palestine disrupting
I love that.
Disrupting the Pride Parade, right? There's none of that. Like this, and I've said this before. The worst statement that has been made in the last decade in our society is someone finding the concept of the only thing I won't tolerate is intolerance, and running with it. And you cannot have a generation that is incapable of critical thinking. You can't give them that, right? Because the obvious intolerance here, to have the LGBTQ community out there and whatever else is attached to that now, embracing what are in many aspects an Islamic cause, and the the homophobia that goes with Islam. Not being able to see that obvious paradox. It's the inability to see paradox, and being able to own that is part of the issue.
I think the bigger issue is so we've come to a point where people feel things.
Yeah.
They don't think as much. Thinking leads to questioning. Question leads to introspection. Introspection leads to having to look at the conclusions you draw on and have to maybe readdress them in light of new evidence.
Which makes you feel bad.
Yeah.
Right. But if you feel something strong enough, then you can justify a lot. I feel that this thing is wrong, therefore I am going to do something about it. And that's what you're sort of seeing on all sides of this argument, which explains why the Queers for Palestine are disrupting the Pride Parade, explains why kids in Germany are gluing their hands to the street because they're protesting the use of fossil fuels, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it's everyone thinking that whatever it is that I feel is the most important thing out there.
Yep.
And that justifies whatever I want to do. And if everyone does that, it's chaos.
Well, yeah. Well, and to me, the feeling, well, I'm offended, right?
Yeah, who cares?
Okay, who cares? That's, you know what? People are being offensive and offended for the history of mankind. You know what? You're being offended offends me. What are we going to do with that? like where does that end?
Yeah.
It's just it should be such a non-starter. But again, all the powers that be are jumping on this shit.
Well, it's politicized though too. So
Yeah.
Well, nowhere more so than in this country. I mean, Canada is rapidly becoming the laughingstock of the Western world, just for the extremes it's going to and its goofiness, just in its approach to everything. Like these menstrual bracelets for men now. It's like, seriously? We got nothing more important going on?
I think I sent you that article about the Canadian Cancer Society apologizing for not using the politically correct front hole terminology.
Yeah, you can't call it
a vagina anymore.
Oh.
No, it wasn't vagina, it was cervix. Yeah.
Cervix.
You can't call
Cervix,
it cervix
yes.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what's a cervix if not a cervix? Because a cervix isn't, well, kind of part of the vagina, but like what?
Right.
It has a separate function.
Yes, but
Yeah, apparently it's politically charged word now.
Oh, good Lord.
It's, you know, I go back to, you know, in industry, in the plumbing industry, having male and female parts, right?
Right.
Or the electrical industry as well, right?
And
Like
and
it's-
you can't use that terminology anymore. And I'm like, why? Because this predated non-binary, right? For some reason, you couldn't say male and female. Like that was a bad thing,
yeah.
right? There are males, no, there were males, there were females. They interacted in a certain way.
Well,
it
it should be remembered, though, that things like the plumbing and electrical industry
are male dominated.
No, not to put too fine a point on it, but they live in the real world. The water either flows or it doesn't.
Yeah.
The lights come on when you flick the switch, or they don't.
Yeah.
Whereas the whole gender debate exists in a completely different realm. The whole concept of trans rights and LGBTQ, those are concepts of ideas that have no real referent or at the very least very little real world impact.
Well,
So
I mean,
they're completely, you know, the people who exist in these worlds are completely and totally divorced from each other.
well, to the extent that they've gotten to now, I agree with you. But I mean, at one point, gay rights was an important issue.
Right, at one point, but yeah, that was decades ago.
Yeah.
We've gone so far past that now.
Yeah.
Again, where we're like you can't call something a cervix now. Like that's decades past Stonewall.
Yeah.
What do they? I still don't know what they want you to call it. Like, because
front hole.
Front hole?
front hole.
Yeah. It's,
Good Lord.
yeah.
I mean, but now I take offense because I've got a front hole and it's nothing like a cervix.
Yeah, exactly, right? Well, and even women, it's not the front hole. Because
Yes.
Well,
Right?
it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and what's a woman these days?
I mean, it's one thing. It's one
Okay.
thing if some student on
Says three cisgender white males
Four.
in the same room together, reinforcing the patriarchy.
Yes.
Oh,
You
okay.
guys got no voice, man.
Yeah.
No voice.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, that's the thing. That's why our listenership is so low.
yeah.
Because, I mean, let's face it, we're nothing but a front for colonialism. I mean, come
Welcome
on.
to the echo chamber.
Yeah.
So, guys, let me ask you a question about going back to Gaza.
Oh, yeah.
What does Hamas get out of this?
So that's an interesting question. I would I would submit that the timing of the attacks, and I'm sure we've all thought about this, but I'll just bring it up anyway. The timing of the attacks was not coincidental as to vis-a-vis what was going on between Israel and Saudi at the time, right? I would not be surprised to find out that if one was to dig deep enough and get into the IRGC QF files, one would find that there was a lot of prodding going on, probably a lot of promises being made from Tehran, particularly regarding the timing and future support, et cetera, et cetera. I would not be surprised to find that. So what does Hamas get out of it? Well, I think in some ways, they didn't expect what was going to happen.
No, they got more than they expected.
They
There's
got
no
more than
question
they
about that.
expected, right? They did not expect this kind of backlash.
Like, in other words, you're saying they expected more Israeli restraint?
I think that to put it succinctly, yes. But I thought they held more cards politically with the Israelis, with the Western world, then it's playing out. I don't think they expected to get quite the face punch they've gotten back. Now, they're playing it for all it's worth, right? Because if they're in a conflict, that is their mode of warfare.
But they are paying for it domestically in terms of politics.
They are paying for it domestically.
You mean within the Palestinian population?
Yes. I mean, both in terms of casualties, but I mean, there's also a certain amount
but
of...
they want those casualties.
Yeah.
Yep. But it's also playing out... I think you're right, but that's a two-edged sword. They still haven't... And this is part of what John was just talking about. I think this is more than they expected to be taking in that respect. At the same time, I think there is a lot of negative public opinion building, simmering.
Within the Gaza population?
Yes.
What have you heard on that?
Just I don't know. Like, I'm not like you. I can't quote the articles and the sources. It's just.
But you've read stuff, because I haven't. To be honest, I haven't been reading on it, right? So I don't know.
I've seen 2 or 3 over the last 3 to 4 months, at least, that have just discussed how the local population is less and less happy with what's going on, right?
Well, let's transition that thought for 1 second, if you don't mind, and let's kind of step into a less comfortable zone of what does a desired end state look like for the Israelis?
Yeah, Patty and I have actually talked about that a little bit, and like after our last podcast, I think, after Trent had left,
Yep.
and we're
you
trying to think
talked
like
without me.
yes, we do.
Oh, sometimes way too long.
Yeah. Oh,
Standing there at the door, flapping gums.
Yeah, eventually I need to leave.
for like an hour, but
It's ridiculous.
well, last time was long enough for me to cook hot dogs.
Yes.
Anyway, but yeah, we're like, because for me, I've never been a big believer that the 2-state solution was going to work, because I think it's just like too big of populations and too little geographical space. And I kind of feel like October 7th killed it. So then we're left with...
Well, you could make an argument you had that on October
Yeah.
6th.
Yeah,
That's what I said, yeah.
you
had a 2-state solution.
you had a 3-state solution.
Yeah, I was going to say it's
Yes.
2
Yeah.
states is tough when you've got West Bank and Gaza split the way.
Yeah. So it was the 3-state solution. Yes.
Yeah. So maybe it goes from 3 to 2. I don't know. But if you're Israel and you can't guarantee, like, short of killing every military-age male in Gaza, which would be a literal genocide, like, and they're not going to do that, obviously. Like, where do you is there a point where you don't occupy them for at least a generation? Like,
Well, and the narrative in the West is that there should not be an Israeli occupation of Gaza.
Well, I don't
Right.
think Israel wants an occupation either. I mean,
Perhaps.
ideally they shouldn't. But
I mean, you could try and turn over the governance and policing of Gaza to a friendly Arab state like Egypt, but that hasn't really worked out well.
Egypt doesn't want it. Nobody in the Arab world wants it.
Yeah, no one
Which is
wants
why
it.
no one ever resettled the Palestinians in the first place.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not like Jordan would be jumping at the opportunity. I mean,
No.
and
Well,
if you're going to give it to anyone, it should be Jordan.
you would think so.
I mean,
but-
Jordan already tried that, and look what happened to the Jordanians when they allowed in so many Palestinian
Black
refugees.
September.
They tried to
Black
overthrow the
September,
Jordanian
yeah.
government,
Yeah,
and the same thing with Lebanon in 1982.
Yes.
When that's why I think the Palestinians are toxic within the Arab world.
yeah.
No, that's,
Nobody
oof.
wants them.
Well, there's
The Palestinians as an
argument to be
issue. I mean,
made
I
for
wouldn't
that.
say the people are, but I mean, that's
No,
that's
I would
dangerous,
say that.
right?
Little column A, little column B.
Yeah.
I don't think it's fair. Like if you go up to if you know a Palestinian as an individual, it's not.
Oh, that's different. But the Palestinians as a nation, as a people, once they achieve a critical mass, they've in every instance where they have resettled in large groups in other Arab nations, they've been a force for instability.
Right, but I mean, again, that's the two-edged sword that the Arab powers that be have allowed to, well, in fact, have engendered and relied on. Right, I mean, this is what they've perpetuated for a reason. Right?
Do you guys?
What was that reason?
It's to maintain that
Common cause
Yeah.
against Israel. That
the optics.
well, and also if you're whatever leader in choose your Arab nation in the 60s and 70s, would you prefer to have your disaffected attention focused on your neighbor
Exactly.
or internal?
Yeah. So you got this lightning rod for all pan-Arabic sentiment.
And it becomes a scapegoat for every problem also.
Yeah.
Well, if it wasn't for...
Yeah.
So try to imagine, as we've discussed, what if Gaza and West Bank were actually prosperous places? If the Palestinian people since 1948, the diaspora, had actually been given the means to live a decent life, there would be no Palestinian question, right? That question would have faded and faded and faded and faded and faded.
Yep.
We wouldn't be having this discussion right now, right? So that's what we're talking about. But I'm going to take the question that you asked, John. What is the Israeli endgame? And I'm going to drill about 5 holes at least in the bottom of it. And say, okay, define Israel in the context of that question. We talk about Netanyahu. We talk about his coalition. We talk about the population at large.
Well, okay, so in the context I asked that question, I would say Netanyahu government, right? Because they're the ones calling the shots right now. So
he just wants to survive. He was fighting to survive before October 7th, right? Which gives credence to the false flag claims, right? If they didn't feed into it, they may have let it happen because
That's a little crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, but
we're
there's a
Al Can't
narrative
Chapeau
going on
territory
right
here.
now
I think.
that Netanyahu's motivated to keep this going because
Now-
that's how he stays in power.
Far be it from me to be the instigator of the tin hats today, but
And you know what? I kind of resent this a little bit, Trent. Work your own side of the street. The tin hats are mine.
Okay, but-
I do the crazy conspiracies, all right? You're supposed to be the voice of logic and reason.
okay. So
Quit honing in on my turf.
here's the logic and reason, and this is why we're talking about Netanyahu, right? If that wasn't the case, if they didn't see this coming and allow it to happen, they didn't see it coming, right? So, and you talk about timing. If I'm not mistaken, it was Yom Kippur again, 50 years later.
Yeah,
right?
it was. It was. Yeah.
So that I feel can't be coincidental, right?
Well,
and the
what?
fact that yet again, just as in Yom Kippur, the Israeli intelligence community did not see this coming. One way or another, this is an indictment of the Netanyahu government. So right now, his end game, survive politically.
It's an indictment of his coalition. My understanding is that the eyes of the IDF and a lot of its combat power had been diverted to the West Bank because the ultra right sections of his coalition are the ones that support the settlements.
Settlements. Yeah.
So a lot of the manpower and combat power had been diverted to the West Bank to protect settlements, and the eyes were turned away. And then the other thing, and this is a little odd, but my understanding is that like most of the people manning the wall in Gaza, like most of the troops were women, which is not to say that they're not capable sensor operators, but when it seemed like there might have been a little misogyny at play because they were the operators, the sensor operators, and the people the women manning the wall were like raising. Trying to raise alarms for like 6 months or so, saying these guys are training for something. We see them, we watch them. They're doing a lot of workup training for something, and they were largely ignored.
I saw.
I heard that as well.
Yeah,
I heard that as well.
So I mean, there's lots of there's lots of blame to go around. It seems. I know, like on October 8th, listening to. Not necessarily like outlets that would know, like the commentary podcast, but they're like, like after this is over, once this is all sorted out, everyone's fired, right? Like intelligence chiefs are fired, military chiefs are fired, BB's fired, the government's fired.
So that's part of your answer for if we're talking Netanyahu.
Yeah.
What's his end game? He just wants to keep going.
Well, okay, but
I don't know.
Or
I think
maybe
that's
he just wants to protect his legacy.
He
He knows he's on the way out. He just doesn't want to go out with this massive cloud over his head.
BB is the shrewdest political operator in Israel, and probably in the Middle East. And so I think he has to know when his goose is cooked. And so I agree with Patty on this one. I think he probably is trying to pad his legacy, protect his legacy, or whatever. But
I think legacy is a reasonable thing. I mean, it's a little. I think it's a little cynical to say that Netanyahu's only motivation right now is keeping himself in power, because that sort of lends towards the let's keep this conflict going as long as possible.
Yeah, and I don't think that's him.
I don't buy that either.
Yeah,
I don't buy it. Like, that's not a palatable solution for the Israeli people anyway, right? There's some point in time they're going to say, hey, this thing, like.
Well, when your options are limited to really bad and a lot worse, I mean, you just keep going with the really bad, right? Like, because before this happened, what was he looking at? He was still looking at corruption charges. That's why he keeps trying to stay in power, to avoid having to face that shit in the courts. And at the same time, he was trying to emasculate the Supreme Court in Israel, right? And that was becoming very unpopular.
That wasn't actually him. That was another part of his coalition, and he had to put that legislation forward. But that wasn't coming from Likud.
So, and we're going down this discussion about internal politics in Israel. That wasn't sort of, and fine to stay there, but but at some point in time,
like I said, radio free digression, man, and this is the issue that's going to take us there.
Yeah.
But more what is Israel's long-term strategy?
In a post Netanyahu world, what is a good end state for Israel?
Post-conflict
world.
Post-conflict, right?
Yeah.
When the conflict ends, when people stop shooting at each other, what does it look like, and what has been accomplished by each side?
Yeah.
Well, that was
more the gist of my question. It's the thrust of my question.
Well, this is a conversation I've had with you and Patty in the past week. I see the impact on global public opinion as being huge. In the same strategic way that Finland and Sweden joining NATO was a huge failure for Russia coming out of the Ukraine. I don't know. I can't help feeling that there's been a watershed here. There's been a Rubicon crossed where a bunch of Western European nations are recognizing Palestine for what that's worth, and that's what we're debating. What does that mean? Right?
Hey, John.
Yeah,
I'd like to get your weigh in on this. Like as Trent mentioned, we've been discussing this back and forth over text. My position is that global public opinion is largely irrelevant to Israel.
I agree.
It doesn't affect anything on the ground, whether or not, again, my position is that global public opinion has always been anti-Israeli on the whole. And that aside from American public opinion, Israel simply doesn't care because it doesn't affect them. And even then, they have worked very hard since 1982 to make themselves rather immune from political swings, sanctions, this sort of thing. What do you see as the effect on the ground in Gaza of this change or this loss of support that Israel has faced in the West over, say, as in the wake of the massive public relations campaign that has been conducted by pro-Palestinian factions?
So I to answer my own question, because I think you're asking me to answer my own question. What I think the Israelis are doing, and internal politics, I'm not discounting any of that. I think that probably does play into it at some level. I think the legacy thing is actually maybe more on point. And what is the legacy? And it's not necessarily the legacy of the individual, though maybe at the individual psychological level it might be. But I think what the Israelis are trying to do, big picture, is say, next time you're thinking about doing this to us, remember what happened last time. Remember the lengths we were willing to go. And I think, 10 years after the firing stops, will all of this international condemnation matter at all to Israel?
I think that's the big question. You're right, because I can see in 10 years, after the dust is settled, depending on what else plays out, I can see everyone just kind of going, okay, that was that was 10 years ago, especially with the attention span people have nowadays, because as we've already pointed out, nobody's talking about Ukraine anymore, right? Who knows what things are going to be like, 3-6 months from now, what the topic's going to be.
But as Israel, you have to, okay, so you got punched in the gut. What is your response to that? And you got punched in the gut by what is effectively another nation state, not just a terrorist organization.
Right.
So not a inconsequential point, I think, but one that often gets lost. So what is the I think there's a strategic message that's being sent out by Israel that is intended to last well beyond the end of this conflict. And that is, next time you guys are thinking about doing something like this to us, remember what we did.
Yeah.
Remember what we were willing to do and that we didn't care how much you came out and condemned us. But remember that you started it.
I mean, there's a lot of practicality that goes with that. But again, strategically, and this has been the big question mark the whole way along, right? And how much are the Israelis contributing to the same miserable diaspora that the rest of the Arab world has been since 1948? And so, great, you win, right? But now you still got this resentful, hateful population on your borders, and it's never, ever, ever going to go away.
So I think,
but they had that on October 6th.
Exactly, and they've had it the whole time.
Right.
That's never. So from an Israeli perspective, that's never going to change.
Yeah,
what I can do is
quo.
I can send a message to the next guy, hostile guy on my border, 10 years from now, when they've been rearmed by the Iranians yet again for the next thing, that they're going to have to think twice about that. It's a painful, hard thing to watch. Conflict always is, and when civilians are getting killed, it's always hard to watch. Mm-hmm. But I don't see a strong alternative, and I've never heard anyone give a strong alternative to what the Israelis are doing. And they're dismantling the infrastructure that was used to attack them in Gaza. Are they going to get every military-age male that has ill intentions to them? No, of course not. It's an impossibility.
Yeah.
Are they going to probably start assassinating senior Hamas guys in Qatar in the next 5 years? I would be surprised if those guys, the bodies don't start dropping there.
Yeah.
Yes, they'll probably do that. But something has to come out of this from the Israeli perspective. You can't, look what we did, right? Like you said, sink a few American boats and we'll firebomb 63-year cities.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
and then drop a new,
and then give you some canned sunshine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Canned sunshine.
So, and
You heard it here first, folks.
No, that's not a Steve original, unfortunately. But
so I
get what you're saying, right? I think what I'm trying to do is answer the unanswerable that came up earlier, right? So part of the not that, right? Again, I point to Ireland. We point to the cynicism of the squalor of the diaspora for 75 years. I think the only solution, and it's a tough one. Emotionally, it can't happen, right? It's only being able to see, okay, let's say you do take Gaza, you occupy it, rebuild the fucking thing, pump a ton of money into it, build it into a society that can sustain itself, has an economy.
Who's pumping the money into it?
The Israelis don't have the ability to do that, though.
yeah. Yeah, again, it would have to be probably incumbent on largely the United States.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
let's say you're the occupying force,
Yeah.
right? Allow it to happen. Allow the aid to come in. Make sure it's administered. I don't know. Like, I'm just saying.
Well, the Israelis have been allowing
where,
the aid to come in, and it's.
Sorry, now we're talking about political and administrative control, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
Israel needs to support that. That's my argument. Strategically, long term, that's the only way out of this. And I get what you're saying, that they're always going to have this, right? So those are their options.
Who wants, aside from Israel, who wants that?
Who wants what? Peace for Israel?
No, who wants prosperity and happiness in Gaza? Israel wants that, obviously, because that's a long-term roadmap to peace. Who else wants that?
Well, you need to get to the hearts and minds of the Gazans themselves, and get them again. You need to get them out of this vicious cycle of
but
misery
Hamas
and anger.
doesn't want that.
Exactly.
Fatah does not want that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, again, that's another rabbit hole, right?
A lot of people within the Arab world do not want that because, again, as John pointed out, it's a lot easier to blame your own failures on the existence of Israel than, the corruption or the mismanagement within your domestic government. So propping up this Israeli-Palestinian conflict is definitely in the direct interests of a lot of leaders, such as the Iranians.
Yeah. Well, I think so. What just occurred to me is now you make Iran the Russia of the area, and you just try to isolate them the way Russia's been isolated. Not altogether
I'll throw
successfully.
Syria in there. I'll throw Libya in there.
Libya's not powerful
some of the
enough
Gulf states I'll throw in there as well.
You think so?
Yeah, well, some of the Gulf monarchies.
They're still out there playing games?
I think some of them are playing both sides.
I think Qatar is for sure.
They're playing both sides.
Yeah. They want to resist their own movements for democratization and accountability within their own populations. So distracting those populations from domestic issues with outrages in the Palestinian-Israeli issue are in the benefit of many Muslim governments, be they Arab or non-Arab.
Well, I think that this is where the West needs to pony up, right? They need to, and again, we can't have that conversation in the West because it's been completely diluted by bullshit. But we need to be able to go, a prosperous Gaza, a prosperous West Bank is a good thing, and we've got to stop giving money to the corrupt organizations who are doing nothing with it but lining their own pockets and arming themselves, right?
Yes.
Okay, so who ponies up the lives of young soldiers who die in this occupation force?
Well, I mean,
what Western nations have to send their sons to die in this effort? Because there will be casualties.
I'm offering an alternative. I'm not saying this is the answer, but you're asking questions. So all I can say to that is someone, right? Is it the Israelis? Right? Is that part of the end game? I'm going to throw that back at you. Is it the Israelis who are occupying, or what are they going to do instead?
No. Well, no. I think what the Israelis are doing, it follows on what John was saying. I think what the Israelis are doing is totally destroying the infrastructure of Gaza, like power, sewer, transportation networks. Because without these fundamental pieces in place, you cannot have a military force. You cannot have an effective military force that can project power over a border if you can't keep the lights on for at least 12 hours a day. You cannot train a paramilitary unless you've got some kind of potable water that you can get access to. You know what I mean? So I think Israel is trying to buy time by destroying vast amounts of the structural social architecture within Gaza. And then maybe as a byproduct, this makes the Palestinian population reevaluate the effectiveness of Hamas as a civil administration.
Well, I think there you've hit on the most important point, because my argument was going to be, up until you said that last thing, right? As Canadian infantry reservists, we know that the one thing that can survive on almost nothing is military-aged males. So even if you've got no potable water, electricity, and stuff like that, the one function of your society that you are going to have that can function to some extent is those militias, those military males. It's the rest of your society that's going to
They're not effective enough to launch the kind of operation that they did on October 7th. They're effective enough to keep control over your own population, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between the British Army and the Argentinian Army in 1980.
Yes. I mean, that goes without saying. But
one was only good as an internal police force. The other was an actual professional military. So if you destroy those structures within Gaza, you degrade Hamas's ability to train for and project force into Israel.
Temporarily.
I think Steve
And
got
then
it
maybe-
here.
And then maybe the Palestinian population looks at, instead of, it's one thing for Hamas to step in and administer a society that has already got transportation and sanitation and energy networks. It's another thing for Hamas to govern as an entity when those things have to be built from scratch. And Hamas is not good at that.
Well, no, they don't want to be
So-
good at it. Anyways,
Well, exactly. And so maybe this is an opportunity for internal dissent within Gaza.
okay, Steve, go.
Well, for one thing, if you completely destroy the infrastructure of Gaza, it creates employment opportunities for military-age males who could otherwise be doing, as long as somebody can pony up the cash.
Yeah.
The thing I was going to mention, it was just a kind of a callback. It was just, does anybody remember the Tom Clancy novel Clear and Present Danger?
Yes.
And his ending to it in the novel, not the movies.
I don't
No,
remember the
fresh-
ending.
It was.
I liked the start of it.
His solution to the Palestinian question was essentially bringing in like a tripartite council of like Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders to like govern both the West Bank and Gaza, and then the actual policing was done by the Swiss guards from the Vatican.
That was
And
at the beginning
just-
of the novel, not the end of it.
No, that was the begin. That was the end. That was his solution. And I was just thinking about that. Man, that just seems so stupidly naive now. That it's just like
Yes!
right? Like it was more just a comment about how Clancy at the time we were all like Clancy was brilliant, when he came out with his stuff. But now it just seems like
I met
just
the man. He was
ridiculous.
very arrogant.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
Well,
So I want. Are you done?
No,
with your
go
point?
ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to go back to something that Trent said about how does the mess get cleaned up and who's going to govern, and your point about being the solution is that Gaza is a prosperous area where people are employed and are not feeling disaffected. Understand completely. And you talked about where rebuilding it to make it that. Here's the problem I see with that concept is no matter who foots the bill, and it'll probably be the West, no matter who foots that bill, who's in charge?
Yeah.
The people of Gaza elected Hamas.
yeah.
They chose that government.
And then since then,
Now,
by certain accounts, that they've maintained iron control over that, and
yes,
they've got secret police out there
right,
making sure there's no dissent, right?
right. So, does this change that? If there's not a change of government there, if there's not a change in the perspective of the people towards their governments,
Well, there has to be. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a hearts and mind to go on here, but there also
have to be, and there hasn't been, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
There's no precedent for suggesting that that's going to happen.
For peace,
Well, there is.
It has to happen for peace, but
For peace, it has to happen.
But it
Yeah,
doesn't
that
mean
doesn't
it's
mean
gonna
it's going to happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
there is a precedent. The precedent is now. And I'm not comparing the two by a long shot, but after the Second World War, Germany and Japan were both told, okay, this is what's happening to you. You have no say in the matter. You're being split up. You're divided into these zones. These laws are in place. You can only have a defense force. You can't have an army, quote unquote, yada, 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 right? They had an occupying force. These things were imposed on them because it was like, you can't be trusted not to do stupid shit.
Okay. Okay. So let's dissect what you just said. What were the preconditions for those to be imposed on them?
Victory.
Absolute
And unconditional surrender.
Yeah.
Right. Like we have made it abundantly clear that you have failed,
Yeah.
and there's no other option except what we're about to tell you.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a good observation.
Okay.
I agree.
And it's important to know that to do that, there were Russian tanks in Berlin. There were Russian soldiers in the Reichstag. There was
Yeah, raising a flag.
It was
I mean,
very- it
they
was
had
very
to
clear
level
to the people.
Germany, right? Like it was
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
This is my other thing. More like in Western politics is, I don't know that there's the political culture that exists in the Western world to stomach winning a war. Because
Well, it seems like
because I don't
we
think
hamstring ourselves.
I don't think what it takes to win the war has changed fundamentally since World War II. But certainly the Western appetite for inflicting that is not there.
Well, no, it's
Right.
only by air. Only by air and artillery. I mean, the stomach for taking the ground casualties is just not there.
Well,
it hasn't been there since.
But you can't do it without it.
I don't.
I know,
I think
exactly.
That's,
That's
only
part of
a
the issue.
component. I think that's only a component. I think that the big thing that changed since the end of World War II is the Cold War, essentially, right? The polarized. You have nuclear powers on both sides,
Yeah.
and neither side can push too far. So let's use Vietnam as an example, right? As an example of where the U.S. was constantly showing restraint and doing all the things to not win
Yeah.
the war.
Yeah.
Why were they doing those things?
Well, because they didn't want to provoke the Chinese.
Yeah, Chinese and the Russians, right? So
And it's the same thing in Korea, right? Like,
same thing in Korea.
yeah.
So I think that's an important consideration for these discussions. So I don't think it's just not willing to take casualties. Yeah, okay, well, we prefer not to take casualties. That's kind of the Western way of war at this point in time. But I think that dynamic of the nuclearized, polarized, post-World War II situation drove a lot of that too. Maybe more so. I think a country like the U.S. could take a lot of casualties if the conditions were set in a way that the public was willing to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a more existential crisis, like a world war.
It would have to be an existential crisis, yes.
Well, I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq compared to Vietnam, the public opinion is a lot different. And so it's a matter of being, okay, can the U.S., can the West have exactly that conversation by taking that conversation that there's people are having right now regarding Gaza and saying, okay, let's turn this fucker on its head and turn it into a solution.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to pause for a comfort break, and then we'll probably come back and maybe try and get onto Ukraine.
Yeah. I said, does the average Palestinian sitting in Gaza at the end of this thing, when the shooting stops, where do they come out in terms of what they want as far as governance? Are they going to say, that was a very failed experiment by having Hamas in charge, and we spent all of our money building infrastructure to attack Israel, vice bettering the lives of the Gazans? Let's look at something different. Or are they just going to be hell-bent on revenge and repeating the cycle? So, I think from an Israeli perspective, this is just the latest in a series of these things that we got to send a strong message as we usually do. Yeah. And that's worked for us in the past, and no
exactly
change.
Short to midterm.
I think the Israelis are hoping for option one, but I suspect they're going to get option two.
Yeah. And I think the Israelis are fully cognizant of that fact, and so they're going to dismantle as much. They're at least going to delay that next attack as long as possible. Yep.
Because by dismantling that infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think what I'm not insisting this is the way things are going to go. My sense right now is there's a strong possibility. There's a lot of potential right now that what's happening, and this is where the narrative comes into play. It's complicated domestic politics in the U.S. And we know that U.S. matters. And in other places, I mean, there used to be a good relationship. You get past the public, but the administrative relationships between, say, Germany and Israel has always been fairly cooperative. Same with the U.S. right now. When the domestic politics become as volatile as they are now, that starts impacting. So I think there is a price to pay for Israel with the narrative. I'm just not sure what that looks like yet.
I don't know. I don't think we've hit that tipping point. It's certainly not in the U.S. I mean, there's a vocal minority of people that are out protest, but look, it's not mass protest. There's not a 1 million-man march on Washington, talking about.
No, but at the same time, I mean,
the Palestinians.
Biden has said some things that are unprecedented for a U.S. president versus, regarding Israel. They abstained in a vote at the UN regarding, Palestinian recognition. I mean, these are subtle signs. Like I said, I don't know what exactly that means, but I see some potential for some negative implications for Israel possible. Anyways,
Here's the fundamental question for the American among us. Will the riots in Chicago this year be worse than the riots in Chicago in 1968?
is that where they're having the
Yeah,
convention?
the Democratic National Convention is back
my
in Chicago
Lord.
this year.
Really?
So it's another one of those history rhyming kind of moments. But anyway, let's see if we can transition over back to Europe
Yeah.
and to Ukraine and the current situation. And
Here we are a year later.
here we are a year later. Yeah. And
Well, let's look back at some of what our analysis of where we might be at this point in time, and say, let's do a little self-assessment. How far off were we?
Well, I think the assessment, if I recall, was what Ukraine had to do with the counteroffensive to make it work, and they did not pull it off.
Right.
yeah.
But did we come with a consensus that we thought they would?
I thought they would.
Yeah.
I thought they would make the breakthrough, and clearly they didn't.
After what they achieved in Kharkiv the year before.
Yeah, they look pretty
Yeah.
promising with that, but then, yeah. So the Russian commander of that, of the from the Russian perspective, the disaster at Kharkiv, it was now the new guy in charge of their new northern front, the newly created Leningrad military district. So that's interesting. So the question is, did he learn from his mistakes? Because it's possible.
Well,
But-
I do recall having conversations about Russians in the defense versus Russians in the offense,
Yeah.
and them being a lot tougher in the defense.
Yeah.
And now they're on the offense again. So actually, because I've been distracted from the Ukrainian question. What is the current situation? Because my understanding is it's actually looking pretty bad for the Ukraine right now.
It was looking bad until the U.S. passed the support bill,
Yeah.
Finally,
and then Russia had its two highest casualty days not too long ago.
ever like
In
the whole 2 years.
In the conflict, yeah,
Okay.
2,600 Russians, give or take, killed in 2 days. Yeah, they're taking serious casualties still, and basically the line's been stabilized. It is
Yeah, they've made some small progress. I was watching Perun's latest account of it, and when you put the whole thing, I'm like, oh, they're pushed here, they made it a little bit here, but then when you put it when you zoom out of the map, it's kind of World War I level gains for some really bad casualties. So
yeah, they're taking
Kind of like they're
serious
trading 10 lives for every meter of territory gained.
yeah, something like that.
And
There's probably more than that actually. But.
And the success that they had was based on conditions that have now changed, which is they relaunched an offensive out of the Belgorod region, attacking villages in the north. So essentially attacking across the border. And the restrictions that the West had placed on them about using Western munitions inside of Russia were hamstringing them from disrupting Russian preparations. So while they had the great success with HIMARS and other systems, shooting into Crimea, shooting into Ukraine, and disrupting Russian preparations for operations, they were hamstrung from doing that.
Yeah.
And
In the
so
northern sector.
because the Russians would mass on the Russian side of the border, and then they just would come across the border, right? So, and concurrent with that was the Ukrainians were suffering a severe ammunition shortage, particularly in artillery.
Yeah.
So they were trying to make up for it with drones, but that only goes so far. So now that ammunition has flown in, now that some of the Western nations, U.S. in particular, have, but not only, have
Greenlit the use of.
they haven't completely greenlit it. They've authorized the Ukrainians to use, and I'll use the U.S. weapons, but you could say the same thing about British or whoever. But the U.S. has allowed Ukraine to use U.S. weapons across the border into Russia in that one particular area for one particular purpose, and only they haven't greenlighted the use of every type of weapon system.
Yeah.
Like ATACMS is not approved for firing into Russia, but HIMARS is.
Why is the United States protecting Russia so much? Like, it seems to me that the most important ally Russia has in this conflict is the United States.
Well, there's a lot of, U.S. is like Trent and I just had this conversation outside. U.S. is like the worst ally in the world, with the exception of all the others. Kind of like the Churchill quote, right? We're a terrible ally because we always have restrictions and constraints and everything else placed on everything. That's why other countries tend to run to countries like China who just don't care. Do whatever you want with our stuff. We don't care. As long as we're making money and we're getting your resources, basically whatever. Why is the U.S. doing what it's doing?
Because this war would be over by now if the United States had just given full, unconditional support to Ukraine. It seems like they delayed, no, we're not going to give them tanks. We're not going to give them Abrams. Okay, we'll give them Abrams. Wow. Okay, we're not going to give aircraft. No, okay, we'll give them the F-16s. And they stall and they delay. And it seems like,
and that's it seems to me that the United
Oh, you froze.
United States is trying to.
You got your last piece got cut.
Try it again. Your last piece where you froze.
Oh, sorry. It just seems to me that the constant delays and obfuscations in American aid. It seems like the Americans are trying to protect the Russians from military defeat.
I think I don't. There may be something to that, and we'd have to dissect that down to the whys and what fors and what exactly is. I think tragic Russian defeat risks use of nuclear weapons, and I think that's probably at some level what the U.S. is concerned about.
So a slow escalation.
So it's the frog in the boiling pot type philosophy. We'll let the frog. We're going to turn up the heat slowly as opposed to throw them right in the fire. And that one may be a way, and you can argue if you look at what's happened, it's kind of worked, right? I'm not advocating for exactly what's been done. I think we're a little too slow on a lot of things, but there's a lot of murmuring out of Moscow about use of nuclear weapons and under what conditions, and now Putin's talking about sending long-range weapons abroad to be used against Western nations, by proxy. And okay, and one would expect that, and I would also expect him to hum and haw a lot about the use of nuclear weapons. I would be really surprised if they used them, but there's probably a point where they would, right? Mm-hmm. There's a point where they might use a tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, they're not going to start a global thermonuclear war over this thing, but they could try to make a point using a tactical nuclear weapon. And then what happens?
Yeah.
What does the West? How does the West respond to that?
What does China do?
What does China do? What does India do? Right. What happens at that point in time?
Yeah. What if there are a bunch of proxies that start? I don't even know where to begin with that. Like, which proxies, which Western nations? You're talking Libya firing at Malta, or, but then if you're that proxy, great, you're adding to the chaos, but you're just going to get spanked.
Like the Houthis shooting at all the traffic.
Yeah, I guess there's that.
So you could see a lot more of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't. To your point, Patty, could the U.S. have ended this thing a number of ways? Probably, or certainly made it much more unpalatable for the Russians doing what they're doing. Yeah, shaped it differently. I don't know that. I mean, the success that the Russians had recently was circumstantially based. I do think that as long as the West keeps supplying weapons in quantity to the Ukrainians, that I don't think the Russians have a chance of having great success.
Did the Ukrainians run out of personnel at some point?
They're having issues.
They're having issues, but then again,
but
I don't.
So are the Russians like who's gonna lose? Who's gonna lose this race to the bottom?
Blinks first, right? And then where's the Russian economy? I think these are the great untangibles.
Yeah, I think the Russian demographics are worse than Ukrainian demographics as far as like they're still haven't taken the hit from their lost generation yet, and so when that comes, like, there's basically a generation missing between the generation that are fighting in Ukraine and the governing generation, and so that's going to be a big problem. That's probably going to bite them within the next 5-6 years. But where are we then? I don't know. The Ukrainians are probably, I don't know. I don't know.
Like how long can the Russians sustain their tempo?
Yeah.
How long can the Ukrainians continue to resist?
Yeah.
Under what conditions are they doing that? Is it this sporadic and unreliable supply chain of munitions coming into Ukraine? Well, that's a tough pill to swallow for them, and I completely sympathize with them on that point. But there's also something to be said, and this is the cynic in me. There is something to be said for maintaining something of a status quo. And again, this is the cynic in me, and I'm not necessarily saying this is a policy. I don't know that it is, but the cynic in me says, well, right now the Russians are tied up.
Yeah.
Like they're basically tied up for the next 10 years, right? Like their military's been decimated. There's arguments that are being made. I'm hearing some, particularly out of like the Baltic states, that actually the Russians are better prepared for war now because they've been in a war for 2 years, and they're actually better off. I don't know that I buy that.
I don't think they've learned from it, and they've depleted a whole bunch of stuff.
It depends, yeah. Because some of the photos that came up for equipment going to this Leningrad military district, there's some photos of some equipment transport trains, and it's like, well, there's some T-62s, and there's some
Right.
some BTR-60s, and
stuff out of long-term storage that they didn't intend to.
Yeah, and so the guys who were using the publicly available satellite footage are counting the old weapons storage lots and stuff like that, and seeing it's just getting, the inventories are shrinking fairly substantially. So,
just as an aside, I find the term decimated.
Yeah, it's a bad.
Oh, it's annoying. Everybody,
it sounds so huge, but it just means 1 in 10.
Yeah,
10%,
right?
Yeah, from the old Roman legions.
yeah.
Yeah, it is a bad term, and I probably shouldn't use it because I know better. But
Well, no, because you're saying it because we all have this.
Everybody uses decimal, and I get that thing, and every time I hear it, I go, so 1 in 10.
right.
Like, that's not that bad. I mean, compared.
10% losses, cool.
Yeah, but it's not great. I mean, 10% losses is more than any Western country is ready to sustain.
Actually heard when a unit no longer becomes combat effective is actually pretty low.
Yeah, that's true enough.
Yeah. It's less than 20, I think, isn't it?
I'm trying to remember doctrinal terms. Like artillery has doctrinal terms. At least U.S. artillery has doctrinal terms for, like, if you're firing a mission, what you're trying to accomplish, like neutralization or. Anyway, but it equals to, you want to create a percentage of casualties, and I think destroying is like 30% or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So,
but destroying versus rendering combat ineffective. That's a.
What destroying basically means the unit is combat ineffective, right? Like that.
Yeah, but
destroying doesn't mean killing everyone.
Yeah, no. Yeah. But
30%, really?
I think that's what it is.
That's like one platoon of a company, right? You still got an understrength company, or an understrength brigade or division, or.
Yeah, but this is artillery, though.
Yeah.
Right, artillery is. Yeah. So.
What do they know?
But I mean, you've seen recently. I don't know. Did you see the article? I don't know if it came out today or yesterday. The Ukrainians may have actually. This is just a little sideshow of one of many things, but the Ukrainians might have actually damaged, possibly destroyed one of the very few Russian Su-57s.
Oh, I saw something about that, but just very briefly.
And they may have
what's that?
They may have destroyed or at least damaged one of the Russian Su-57s.
Yeah, they did it with a drone, and it was
drone.
one of their own, I think, domestically produced drones or something, and it was inside Russia. So
yeah, it's like 400 miles inside Russia, 300 something miles. So,
when did this happen?
Yesterday?
Like the last 24 hours.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard that they took out a Tu-22
It was apparently
on a drone strike.
Yep.
But that was the latest I heard.
I think they happened near concurrently.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's just interesting, like how the asymmetry of the warfare is changing. I mean, the Ukrainians are sending special operations forces abroad now to attack Russians in third countries, like Syria
Yeah.
and Sudan.
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
Holy shit.
So I think the Ukrainians are playing it smart. I mean, they're
Yeah, like attacking Russians outside of Russia makes sense. Like Russian government.
Well, you disrupt. It's all about disruption of the other guy.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how are we going to cause the most disruption to you?
Create-
And they're attacking the Russian energy infrastructure, which
Yeah.
is smart because that's what's fueling.
Well, that's what's painful.
literally and figuratively
Yeah.
fueling the war machine. So,
Yeah.
So that's why, like, the whole, like, who blinks first piece is an interesting question, and like where this leads as the Ukrainians are only going to do more of that, right? Like, that's completely in their interest to do that, to bring the fight into Russia.
Yeah.
How do the Russian people react to that? How does that affect the Russian economy in the long term? You know, does Gazprom start suffering significantly? Does the Russian economy start suffering significantly? How long does it take for those effects to be shown in the Russian economy? If the people start suffering in tangible ways, does that cause conditions for the conflict to end on a more palatable endpoint for the Ukrainians? I would.
Or does it create conditions for the Russians to escalate?
Or that's the alternative.
Right.
But what is escalation? If you're Russia, what is escalation right now?
Well, Putin can't afford to blink.
He personally can't, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So what becomes the watershed moment there?
Yeah.
Unless, well, okay, I say Putin can't under the current conditions, but if you can change the dynamic enough in Russia, where the Russian people are starting to demand change, that might change that.
Yeah, it's hard to think about
blink.
what the Russian military is doing now or not doing now that they could be doing. Like,
From a conventional perspective,
yeah, like I
there's
can't
not much.
I can't imagine waves of Russian bombers trying to because both nations are hamstrung by the others by air defense networks. So
Yeah, if you're,
it's
I mean, if you're the Ukraine, I don't see any options but defense at the moment. You just keep letting the Russians grind themselves on you.
It's not a bad tactic.
Doesn't get you any ground back. Will they have any
But also-
offensive capability at any point?
Yeah, you don't have any offensive capability at the moment. Certainly not until your F-16s come online. And I read yesterday on ISW that the training for the F-16s is taking longer than anticipated.
Yeah.
And instead of being available in late summer, they may not be available until mid-autumn.
I don't see them as a
In the
game changer
meantime,
or anything.
yeah, exactly. Let the Russians foist themselves onto your pikes.
I mean, the whole F-16 thing, it's like the latest weapon system. I don't view any single weapon system as being a game-changing thing.
well, and we
The
talked.
French are saying-
HIMARS changed things.
It had an impact on the battlefield, had a significant impact, but it wasn't a game changer,
Right. Yeah.
right? It didn't change the fundamental outlook of the conflict, right? Like, it didn't, like, the Russian army wasn't defeated because of HIMARS.
Yeah, it didn't send the Ruskies scampering for Belgorod. So yeah.
Right. And I don't see the F-16 doing that. The French are talking about Mirage 2000s now. Okay, fine.
And we'd said that last time we were here that we didn't think that F-16 was going to be a real game changer. It was probably at best going to be bring the Ukrainian Air Force more to parity.
Well, I think the thing that has happened with the authorization to shoot across the border, because we think about that in terms of ground-to-ground systems, but it also applies to ground-to-air systems. And the Ukrainians were lobbing their glide bombs in. And that was actually the one thing that was working. Not the Ukrainians, the Russians. Lobbing their glide bombs in, which were giving them the conditions for most of the success that they were having. So they were able to keep their aircraft in Russia, lob in the glide bombs, huge, 3,000-pound bombs, and essentially using that as massive artillery to support their offensives. And that's where they were getting their success. Mm-hmm. Now that's a bit changed. Yeah. And the argument is the F-16s and maybe the Mirage 2000s would further hamper the Russians' ability to use weapon systems like that, to use their air force to support offensive operations in an effective way.
Yeah, if they can
Push the envelope back.
Yeah, if they can start effectively using harms within Russia to work on dismantling the Russian air defense capability, then that will create opportunities for them.
Yep.
But it's a hard network to dismantle. But though they've tried, and
Well, they hit.
they just hit an
that
S-400 system.
Was it? I think it was a 300.
Was it?
The news was always saying S300/400.
Was it?
And I was like, well, it's not the same thing, but okay.
Yeah. But they look similar because they both use
yeah.
a vertical launch system. But
But
So-
yeah, it's so in front the front lines. I don't know. It seemed to, at least everything you hear in the front line, all sort of reliable sources suggest the front line stabilized almost immediately as soon as those conditions were. Like the U.S. Weapons started showing up, and the approval to shoot cross border happened.
yeah.
So now it's stabilized.
I mean, it's stabilized is relative. It doesn't mean no movement. It just means no significant movement.
Yeah.
So our assessment is Western Front. Best for the Ukrainians to stay on the defensive. Ukrainians have no offensive capability right now. F-16s aren't going to change anything.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't think you can do offensive activity without at least a local air superiority.
Yeah.
A local and temporary air superiority.
But
And I think that's the primary reason why their offensive failed in 2023. And so there's no offensive operation by the Ukrainians until their Air Force comes online.
we just talked about them not being a game changer. So
I didn't say that.
No,
I define game changer, guys.
So that becomes my question. Okay, so it didn't make anyone run away, but did it create the conditions to do step-by-step operations that do eventually create?
I'm going to disagree with you on this one, Patty. I don't think the F-16s are some panacea. I think that they are another weapon system that gives the Ukrainians a somewhat better capability to deal with Russian air power. I don't see them dominating, even creating local air supremacy or superiority in an area. I mean, the Russian Air Force is just too big for that. And the F-16 it's capable, but it's not that great. I mean, it's a good.
Well, I can't disagree with you on that point because you're right. But what I am saying though is that Ukraine has no ability to recapture territory without them.
So for me, what I'm hearing is Ukraine won't be taking back any significant amount of territory anytime soon. So now we're back to
not anytime soon. And I mean, say by 2024 or within the 2024 calendar year. I can't see the Ukrainians being able to recapture any territory.
So prognosis for now to be reconvened either in January or next June.
June of 25.
It's the race to the bottom. Who loses the race to the bottom?
Well, it's the same thing. Like Ukraine has to husband all its resources as much as it can, and spend it as spend their lives and their resources
Munitions
as thriftily as possible.
I think they've been doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, no, I think they have too. They've generally, while causing the Russians to expend as much of theirs as they can,
and create an asymmetric warfare situation for the Russians to deal with. So it's not like I'm fighting you on the front lines. I'm fighting you now, west of Moscow.
Yeah.
Right? Like you have to worry about your entire country. Not only do you have to worry about your entire country, but you got to worry about the activities you've got going on in Africa and the Mideast, and now everything Russian is now potentially targetable.
Yeah, and if like a Ukrainian special operations team can get themselves to Siberia and start blowing up pipelines to China,
Which may Yet happen.
Could happen.
Who knows? You know, it's
I mean,
interesting,
it
Patty.
could-
Oh, I'm sorry. Finish.
I was just gonna say it can happen in peacetime because we just had a pipeline, natural gas pipeline, going to BC blow up west of the city in Edson here, so it start a forest fire this week.
Patty, there was do you remember that? I don't remember how. It was a few months ago, but the Ukrainians did hit a strategic radar system inside Russia that was linked to their nuclear deterrence or nuclear detection.
Yeah.
And the U.S. got a little amped about that, which is insightful, right? Like that. Like, let's think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainians successfully blew up a strategic Russian radar. On the face of that, you'd think, hey, 2 thumbs up. But the U.S. was like, don't do that. Don't go after those things because if the Russians feel blinded to a potential nuclear attack, they may act irrationally, and that's what we're concerned about.
Yeah.
Right.
So please don't keep their nuclear deterrence active.
Or their detection. Yeah.
Their nuclear. Yeah. I'll lump it under deterrence, but detecting assumes part of the deterrence.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting thing. It wasn't lauded. It was sort of cringed at a little bit. Like, please don't do that.
Yeah.
Go ahead and blow up those S-400s all you want, but don't hit those strategic systems.
Don't touch anything attached to their ICBM fleet.
Yes. So I thought that was an interesting little. It sort of gave some insight into where the U.S. is thinking about this, and I think the U.S. is thinking, to your earlier question about why the U.S. hasn't done more, is not wanting to push the Russians too far into a corner too quickly, maybe.
Yeah, trying to protect them from. I get the sense that what they're trying to do is make it so that the Russians can't win, and so that they voluntarily come to the negotiating table on their own.
Yes.
They don't want the Russians to lose, but they want to make it so that the Russians can't win.
Agreed. And I go back to my comment about the cynic in me says that there are advantages to keeping this thing going.
So,
yeah.
Along those lines, my next question is, okay, how do the politics play out? How long economically, political economics, how long are the Western nations going to keep propping this up? And how much is that going to change with, the European elections that are happening right now? The presidential election in the U.S. this year.
Yeah, and that's a big factor. And I think Putin's banking on seeing how that plays out. There's a lot of I find the whole thing odd and disturbing actually at the same time, is that it's almost the exact opposite of where we were politically in the 80s in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. In the 80s, it was the conservatives, the Republicans and Reagan, who was, let's confront the Russians.
Yeah.
And now it's somehow flip-flopped, where particularly the far right is like, why are we spending all this money in Ukraine when you just secure our border?
Oh, yeah.
That's sort of a big narrative. Even my kids are saying that now, and I'm like, come on, guys. So
in theory, you could do both, but
right. But why are we giving $100 billion to Ukraine? I was like, well,
so we don't have to
send a lot of lives.
So we don't have to send a couple divisions
more,
over to
Right.
Right.
So, but that is, to your point, Trent. That is a serious consideration. Now you've got far right party in Germany's gaining ground. What's going to come out of the European elections, and I'm sure the Russians are looking at that pretty closely.
Yeah.
Because they do realize
when they have
success.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say when they have had success is when the West kind of balked on continuing their
support. Yeah.
I predict a schism developing in the West between the Europeans and the Americans, and that the Europeans become more hawkish and want to end this war with a Ukrainian victory and are much more anti-Russian in their stance than the Americans are. Where the Americans want to preserve, I think the Americans want to preserve the Putin regime on the basis of wanting stability and predictability, figuring better the devil we know, that if Putin gets overthrown, do you get like a nut bar like a Prigozhin, taking over. So they want to try and leave that golden bridge available for the Putin regime to do a nice, stable, negotiated settlement, whereas the Europeans, I think they reject this and say, no, you don't live with these guys, a perpetually hostile, aggressive imperialist power on your doorstep. We want to end this. We want to remove Russia's ability to aggressively threaten Europe. So I think you're going to see an influx of European aid through 2025 onwards, and that Europe becomes the primary arm supplier and supporter of the Ukrainians. And I think we're going to see a decline in American influence in the situation after 2025.
I don't disagree with you. In fact, I think it goes back to, we talked about this in our last one about, well, what happens if Putin's not there? What are the alternatives? Mm-hmm. And the alternatives could be far, and are likely to be far worse than Putin.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that is absolutely correct. And I don't disagree. In fact, I do disagree. I completely agree with what you just said. It's like the world's turned on its head a little bit here. Like we go from the 1980s and Reaganism to now. Europeans were very dovish back then, and the U.S. was like, "No, let's push the Russians into a corner." And now it's sort of becoming. I mean, you get the French are. I mean, for God's sakes, the French are talking about putting troops on the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, okay, yeah. For what that might be worth, right? You know, like, so does Germany plant a bunch of trees along the boulevards, right? But when we're talking about Europe, yes, unilaterally, the Brits, the Poles, the Baltic states, France. They're all stepping up, right? But it's the populism. This is why I brought up the European elections in particular, right? Because there are already jokers in the pack. Turkey. So NATO and European Union. Hungary's the big one, right? There was even a schism in, I can't remember if it was Czech Republic or Slovakia, where they've got a crowdfunding thing going on to buy shells to ship to the Ukraine because the populist president or prime minister, the leader, is against their government providing stuff to the Ukrainian people.
I think that was Slovakia.
I think it'd be Slovakia because the Czechs were the ones leading the efforts to try and buy shells from everywhere else to send to Ukraine.
Okay, so I knew it was one of the two. But so we've already got these jokers in the pack for these collective, NATO and EU. So I can see that getting worse now as populism and far right is rising.
I think we can look at it.
The northern, like the nations around the Baltic are going to be more pro-Ukraine, whereas the southern European nations are going to be less so.
Yeah, well, especially the Pan-Slavs, right? Like the Serbia,
the Balkans, the Hungarians. The Romanians are an exception because they're a frontline state.
Yeah.
But those areas are going to be, not as keyed up on this. But if you go on the school that after the Russians win in Ukraine, the next step is the
Baltic states,
the Baltics and the Suwalki Gap, to try and establish a continuous land link to the Kaliningrad Oblast through Belarus. If you are anywhere attached to the Baltics or would be affected economically by a Russian action in that theater, then you're going to be pretty bullish on protecting Ukraine.
Well, that's why everyone should be looking at this way. I mean, John, you were saying you're having that conversation with your kids, right? Yeah. That's what everyone needs to be looking at this. But that doesn't mean that's the conversation that's going to occur. Right.
Well, okay, so
that could be Viktor Orban. Let's take it south. Like the Croatians, do they really care what happens in the Baltic? Not that much.
I think we can doom and gloom a lot of this stuff here about what's going on, but I think there's some rays of hope too, and at least one of them is that NATO seemed to have woken up to the reality of modern warfare and preparing itself. So. Suddenly you've got ammunition.
With one exception.
Parts of NATO.
Well, okay, parts of NATO. Okay, but the U.S. has been complaining for decades about European nations' commitment to
Well, we just joined that list and we're at the top of that list now.
Yeah. So, but you're starting to see that. You're starting to see ammunition production increase a little bit more. So, take that U.S. complaint off the table, at least to some degree. So I think that's a positive aspect. We're all seeing that the Russians weren't as formidable as we all were concerned they would be. And certainly, despite huffing and puffing out of Moscow, the Russians don't want anything to do with a conflict with NATO. And then despite whatever rhetoric Putin's saying, we're already in a conflict with NATO. No, you're not. You know you're not.
Yeah.
You know you're not, because your fleet's still intact and your air defenses are still intact, right? Like
Yeah.
you're not in a conflict with NATO. NATO is supplying. Right. So big difference.
Yeah. If your submarine fleet isn't blockaded inside Murmansk, and yeah.
So, huffing and puffing aside, he doesn't want any piece of that. No. So, I almost see when he comes out and makes these statements like that, I sort of view that as an act of desperation in a little way, right? Like,
as for
basically
domestic consumption or whatever he can achieve outside.
No, when he starts humming and hawing about nuclear weapon use, I view that as whatever it is you're doing right now, he doesn't like, you should probably keep doing that.
Mm-hmm.
That's because he's saying the most outrageous, the thing you're most fearing.
Yeah.
To try and induce
fear.
Self-deterrence within the United States.
Exactly. You're pressing the right button at that point in time.
Yeah.
Now you can't take that too far, right? Because then.
Because he can actually press the button. Yeah.
If you take it too far, he does.
Yeah.
But
like Polish tanks on the road from Belgrade to Moscow, that's probably going to bring attack.
That would do it.
Yeah. Right. Like.
Yeah, that would do it.
But I got a question for you, John. Moving away from Ukraine, but looking at like what we saw, the performance of the Russian military, do you think anything can be extrapolated from that to, say, the Chinese? Like, because the things we saw, like, we saw a lot of corruption, a lot of problems, and stuff that we thought were kind of endemic to authoritarian regimes, right? Because I don't know how the Chinese are in corruption. It seems like they still have some pretty bad corruption problems, and it seems to me that authoritarian regimes generally like corruption problems because they tolerate it until they need to prosecute you, and that gives them a ready excuse to prosecute you.
And corruption has its place in regimes like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it actually serves a function, but
yeah, it does, but it serves a number of functions. But
so China. So if we talk about China, we're probably talking about Taiwan, right?
Yes,
so that's what we're concerned about.
Right, like
so let's, and this is where a lot of U.S. attention has gone recently, is Taiwan.
Yeah,
right. For the obvious reasons, and one could argue that what happens in Ukraine is going to be sending a message to the Chinese also. Mm-hmm. So another reason to sort of say, let's not let the Ukrainians fail, because we need to because the bigger picture is the Chinese are watching that.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if like there's parallels between like the Russians' lack of effectiveness, if the similar parallel, we might see a similar parallel in the Chinese.
It's hard to know though, because the Chinese, what was the last conflict the Chinese fought?
1979
against Vietnam.
Against Vietnam, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was their second go at Vietnam because they got their freaking asses kicked in the first one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, the Chinese, I would suspect, are probably much more capable than the Russians. Mm-hmm. I think they've intentionally been investing in high-tech weaponry, intentionally been investing in weaponry that is designed specifically to try to accomplish what their objectives are.
Yeah.
The troops are going to be a bit more, going to have a bit better morale too.
I think they'll have, right. I think they will. I think some of the problems the Russians had, the Chinese won't have. Having said that,
yeah,
if you're a country that hasn't been involved in a conflict, and so in other words, all your military leadership,
yeah, exactly,
has not had to deal with things like logistics.
Yeah,
like really legit. Okay, and I look at Taiwan and I'm thinking, yeah, it sounds great that they've got this huge military that they're building up, but crossing that water.
I was going to say that this is not the thing. Yeah, this is not the same thing as a drive on Kiev.
Right. No,
and there's only so many ports that the Chinese can stage out of. And you got to think that every single one of them have been targeted by Taiwanese missile batteries.
Yeah,
yeah, and it's 100 miles straight, and
Yeah.
That's a lot of opportunity for American missile submarines to start sinking stuff,
Exactly.
or attack
Yep.
submarines to start sinking stuff. And I mean, it'd be like the American Navy's happy time, right?
To an extent.
If they get
To an
involved,
If-
right?
If they get involved.
Well, I mean, it seems like the strategic ambiguity over Taiwan has kind of gone by the wayside narratively,
I
if
don't
not
know, man.
officially.
Currently.
Sorry?
I mean, currently.
I don't know.
But the problem with the U.S. is,
Yeah.
They're fickle.
exactly. We're like the worst ally in the world.
America is a fickle and unreliable ally.
Yes, it's true. It's
Well,
true.
It's sad but true. Like, I don't like saying it, but
Yeah.
it's true.
Yeah.
Well, again, I think that's where the Ukrainian model comes in. Like you said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to feed them a whole bunch of stuff. We probably already are. And,
Until we stop.
you know, I think the fact that you have to go across that water to get there is,
If it was land, if it
is
was
the
land
biggest
bridge,
deal.
totally,
Yeah.
totally different game.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally
But yeah, like a,
Crossing that water.
an opposed amphibious landing across 100 miles.
Yeah, and the
Australia
Chinese
is-
Navy
is a hard
is,
thing.
they just launched their new carrier, and
Yeah.
but I mean, come on, crossing that water, that's not a small thing.
No.
And then sustaining yourself logistically once you cross the water. Can they cause a huge amount of damage in Taiwan? Can they
For sure.
disrupt the global chip supply? Yeah.
Yeah, well, they don't even have to cross the water to do that,
No,
right?
they
Yeah.
don't have to. But I mean, is that in their interest?
No.
I don't think that's in.
No,
their
I think they want Taiwan
They
relatively
want to have
intact,
it. Yes.
right? Because it's
Yeah.
it's a massive economic engine that you don't want to destroy in there.
Right.
They're,
So
they're
that
very
effect-
cognizant of economic issues, if nothing else.
So if you don't want to destroy it, you don't want to break it in the process of taking it. That
Yeah.
actually has a lot of implications into your war plan also.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they're at the point. I know Xi said 2025, but I don't know. I just don't think they're there,
No.
and I don't know that they will be there anytime soon. And what do they gain versus what do they have the potential to lose? So if you're sitting in that chair and you're like, well, I really like to have Taiwan, but here's the reality of what I'm facing to do that. And the potential loss, seems like the potential loss is far greater than the potential gain.
Yeah. It seems like Xi has been willing to sustain some economic harm in reasserting the role of the Chinese government in but that much harm yeah, there's no value to him to getting a destroyed Taiwan.
Right.
Maybe some perceived prestige or
And-
reversing a slight to the Communist Party or something like that. But
And how much prestige would it be given the cost that China would incur?
yeah.
Right. I mean, you
Like, I agree with you. That game's not worth the candle for Xi.
No.
Did
and
you say
the
we're the
potential
Swedes?
for catastrophic failure exists also.
Yeah.
I mean, you could
Oh,
try
yeah.
and fail and lose everything you've been building up over the last, decades. And then where are you at?
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah.
And then you lose the mandate of heaven, and it's the same problem that Putin has. Total defeat means new leadership, and Xi doesn't want that.
No.
Like, Xi's personal stakes are very high.
Yeah.
So that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. That's one man's opinion.
Yeah, for sure. But your opinion is more educated than mine, so
Still one man's opinion.
And that's
Well,
I think Patty cut off.
why we bring in. People have heard enough of us three morons yapping away at this.
Whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not sure I like the M word for either of us.
no, I think it applies.
Well, that's what I was going to. Oh, complete aside. But our next neighborhood over, when I drive to the grocery store, there's a sign that says, it's got three words, one after the other: above, below, below. Right? Slow down, kids. And I'm like, I thought we weren't supposed to call them that anymore.
Kids?
Kids?
Slow downs, kids.
Slow downs, kids. You have to put an S on the down, Patty.
Yeah. Boom.
Yeah.
So long as you just don't mention anything about cervixes, you'll be okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Down syndrome's okay, but cervix is no.
Yeah. Yeah. Just don't assume the gender of these Downs kids.
That's right.
All right.
So here, let me propose a topic for your next, if you haven't hit this one already, is the men or biologically born males participating in women's sports.
Oh yeah.
That's become a big thing in the U.S. now.
I don't know if we talked.
It's kind of a thing here too.
Yeah,
Kind
it's kind. I don't know if we talked about it at all or not.
of. We haven't talked about it yet, but it's kind of an issue. Like
this
there
is
was
where-
that power lifter here in Alberta.
I mean, there comes a point at which the 3 to 4 cis white patriarchs sitting around discussing a topic, we're all going to agree, and no one's going to want to hear what we have. This is the one where I'm just like, no,
Yeah,
we don't
that's
make a
Yeah.
podcast about this.
Yeah.
Okay, first
Why
off,
not?
I resent being called a patriarch because my wife would probably disagree.
Disagree with that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you'd think, right? Like we got it coming both ways.
Do you think, Trent, that we're all in a unanimous agreement on that issue, or
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
Probably.
are.
Yeah, basically all I've got to say to everyone out there who might look at me a certain way and my opinions, I'm like, you know what? I spent 50 plus years in a binary world. Let me catch up. Like just
boomer?
yeah, exactly, right? And that's going to be the response.
But he's not. He's an ex like the rest of us.
I am
I know,
actually
but he's talking like a boomer.
65 is right on the cusp. I get to pick and choose as I wish.
That's true. Yeah, you can, you got a
Sorry.
fence in either camp, or you got a foot in either camp.
To on this particular topic, I am Gen X.
There you go. The forgotten generation now, as it seems. But I follow these Gen X people, or I don't follow. They keep coming up with my YouTube shorts feeds, and so how about Gen X is forgotten and all that. But anyway, it feels like we're out of war talk to talk about, so maybe it's a good place to cut her off and
Yep, sounds pretty good.
talk to you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
Ciao.
Ciao.